Hi everyone, welcome to AFI Docs 2020 presented by AT&T. I'm Adam Piron, the short film programmer for the festival. First, I'd like to thank our supporters of the festival, our presenting sponsor AT&T, and our AFI members, and you, our audience. One quick moment, I'd like to sort of recognize a lot of the, all the filmmakers that are playing, in particular in the shorts program. We received over 1,000 shorts this year, and it was a pretty difficult task getting it down to the films that you can see in all of the shorts programs that we're playing. So I just also really wanted to call out the artistic quality of all of these works, and each of them have like a very specific formal and stylistic approach that I think really stand out, and I think they also show just sort of the state of documentary filmmaking right now. And it's all these works are something to not only track, but I think it's also exciting to see what these filmmakers have on the horizon. We're here today with the filmmakers of Shorts Program 1, Amiran, director of DAFA METTI, Martyna Starosta, director of Elevator Pitch, Alexandra Lazarowich, director of Lake, Alison Klayman, director of Flower Punk, Jesse Auritt, director of The Paint Wizard, and Dane, co-director of MIZUKO. I'm curious, like with all of you, you guys all have very specific formal approaches on how you approached your subjects and how you essentially wanted to tell the story that you did within the short format that you guys all chose. And I guess just sort of starting off with Tal, I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate a bit more in terms of how you came about that.
So the form was pretty much dictated by the subject matter, because my film is about illegal Senegalese migrants living in France illegally, selling souvenirs of the Eiffel Tower, trying to make a living actually, just about surviving. When I started, my idea was perhaps similar to my previous shorts, where I think my previous two shorts, I see DAFA METTI as a bit of a third in a trilogy of 3 shorts dealing with people working in an outside space and migration as well, actually. My approach was, what I had in mind was perhaps finding my subject, making an observational doc, perhaps having some interviews, I wasn't quite sure, but perhaps halfway through the process, it became clear that because these guys are all illegal, I had to think of a different way of telling the story, because I was purely, I was just not able to show their faces or reveal their identities. But it was important for me to make the film cinematic, and I knew right from the off that I wasn't interested in anything to do with blaring faces or filming them from the back or anything like that. So halfway through the process, having done the interviews, but audio interviews, I never really have talking heads interviews in my film. The challenge was really, okay, so how I'm going to tell that story? And then the idea of finding metaphors and symbolism in Paris, which is almost a bit like the sort of the hidden part of Paris, the more like the underbelly of Paris, the Paris that, on the surface is very, glitzy and very sort of, trendy and fashiony for tourists, but actually there's a whole different Paris, which is the Paris that these guys sort of experience in their day-to-day life. So how, the challenge for me was really, how do I bring that visually and, and audio as well, in terms of the soundscape of the film to tell that story. So in terms of the form, was very much informed by the subject matter.
Great. And Martyna, how about yourself?
My film is Elevator Pitch, and it is about, it's looking at how inaccessible the subway is to parents with young children, or to people with disabilities, or to the elderly, or to filmmakers with heavy equipment. And I think my challenge was that it's like an injustice or inequality that it's totally obvious, that is hidden in plain sight. And so everybody who lives in New York just takes it for granted. So when we use the subway, or when we used to use the subway before the lockdown, I think it was like a lot of people just perceived it as a nuisance, but they would just rush by. And then the people who couldn't access it often weren't even visible to the people who were commuting. And so my challenge was really, how can I take something that we take for granted that's so obvious and make it much more visceral of an experience. And so what I wanted to try out, it's something I had wanted to try out for a long time, was using tableau shots. And so I would have these fixed tripod shots that would capture real-time movements. And so if somebody with a cane needed 1 minute to get up one single flight of stairs, that's how long it would take. Those were the visuals. And then I discovered that the MTA, the transportation system, had like monthly board meetings. And every month people would come and complain and voice their frustration at these meetings that like nobody would hear about. Like they weren't that much covered in the press. And it was really fascinating because people had very personal stories. Like somebody was telling a story about living with seizures, and she was always afraid that she would get seizures when going up or down the stairs. And so what I did is then I listened to 2 years of complaints and then created an audio collage that would create suspense. And so there's this juxtaposition of these very static images where people are jaded and resigned and they take things for granted. And then there's the audio collage where we can really hear the collective anger of New Yorkers at the state of things.
This film, like, was an interesting project because it was a partnership with the National Film Board, who commissioned it for a series of films called 5-minute feminist films. And so we were tasked with making 5-minute films about feminism. And it was any interpretation of feminism. And I had been wanting to make a film about female ice fishing women from my remote community in northern Alberta. And I had pitched the idea for a really long time to many different broadcasters and funding boards, and everyone was sort of like, oh, you want to make a 16mm -30 film about women fishing? Pass. So this was an opportunity that was presented, and I leapt on it, and the National Film Board really supported the project, and we went out and filmed on, I think approximately, we only did 8 rolls of film. We shot on 16. It was -27 outside, and we shot for 2 full days. And I worked with an all-Indigenous female crew. And the point was to make a verite film that just follows these women doing these simple tasks. Mostly because I have a passion for showing Indigenous stories, but also reframing it, because sometimes Indigenous stories also have this like weird tinge of the patriarchy. So it's always implied that Indigenous women like do the beating and the sewing, which yes, they do. But these also 2 badass women like ice fish in -30 weather. And actually Jamie, who's in the film, was 6 months pregnant at the time. And it just shows how badass these women are. And this has been something that they've been doing for generations. So with that limited amount of rolls of film that we were actually very paranoid about ruining, because we had to keep carrying the cameras to the car to keep them warm. And so that the batteries would keep working, because it was so cold out on that lake, and we were never really sure what we were going to get. And so from that, we did this amazing 5-minute film that really sort of captures a traditional practice, but also shows the modern way that Indigenous people are using tools and trucks to get the job done.
I looked at this film as, you know, it's kind of my 3rd film about an artist. And I'm always looking for, like, what's the right way to tell this artist's story that complements their body of work and adds value, right? And context. That's kind of what I think of when I think of documentary filmmaking, when it comes to spotlighting someone else's art. And in the case of Azuma Makoto, who's a flower artist, in this, the works themselves are like, in some ways, you're like, they're self-explanatory and spectacular and breathtaking. It's sort of the epitome of like a picture you know, says 1,000 words. And he also works a lot with time lapses, and, you know, is very meticulous about how things are going to look and be captured. And I thought, you know, I was really interested in the idea of the passage of time in relation to his work with flowers, and also with the passage of time in terms of his evolution as an artist. And I guess that's where I saw that I could contribute, was like to understand why he does what he does. I think I'm always interested in artists because they, you know, are so passionate and, you know, focused sometimes for an entire lifetime on a certain, you know, their body of work might be very passionately, you know, driven on examining one single question. And working with flowers, how did he get there, and what motivated him? I guess, you know, so when it came to it, I didn't want to just do like I was a commercial coming in, just trying to get the most spectacular, kind of obvious slow motion shot. I wanted to figure out what makes him tick and to go inside some of the artworks themselves and like the work that went into it from conception to, you know, how he, for the people who've seen the film, you know, but I know the other filmmakers here, we haven't necessarily seen each other's films yet. You know, he sent flowers into space, or into the stratosphere rather. And he also sent them down to the bottom of the ocean. And, you know, that he actually says was much more difficult than sending it into space. And there's just these, you know, the challenges and the practical things, and also his response to Fukushima and that disaster, which I think made a real intervention in his creative process. So, you know, I went to spend some time with him and figure out what I could contribute. And I think that, you know, I was very intimidated by it because I felt like the works are pretty great when you just look at them yourself and you have like an amazing story in your head and they're so breathtaking. Like if the movie doesn't do that, then like what was the point of making a movie? It's like gilding the lily, to use an extended metaphor. So yeah, that was my thought process in making this film.
Well, thanks. Jesse, how about yourself?
My film, The Paint Wizard, is a profile of a transgender house painter in Austin, Texas, who only 3 years ago, at the age of 58, sort of came to accept herself as being transgender and come out to the world. And I made this film along with my co-director, Jessica Wolfson, who unfortunately, due to technical difficulty technical limitations, couldn't be in the Q&A with us. But, you know, when we met Millie, and she is a very eccentric character and, you know, has gone through a lot of personal hardship in her life, and her struggles that she deals with and just accepting herself are very personal, and it's something she's very much still working through. And so, you know, we decided, making the film, we wanted to tell her story from her perspective in as intimate way as possible. And so, you know, for all the shoots, it was just the two of us shooting and doing sound, just to, you know, not have any other distractions. And so she would feel comfortable. And one of the things, you know, we wanted to portray in the film is, you know, her personal life it's, you know, for lack of a better word, it's messy. It's still this work in progress. And but she's really put together a successful house painting business for herself in Austin. She's pretty well known around town, mostly because she also drives around her motorhome to work, and she will park it outside of her client's house and basically lives there for the duration of the job. But she is a really accomplished house painter, and we wanted to show sort of the juxtaposition of her personal life and professional life, and portray that in the way we shot. So for, you know, in any of the scenes we followed her in her personal life, we, you know, shot it pretty much verite, fly on the wall style, handheld, following her around. And, you know, I think that shows in some of those scenes of just, you know, kind of sporadic camera movements and whatnot. But then for her, when we filmed her painting, we, you know, really thought through that and wanted to have more of a composed lockdown shot. So to just let her work kind of show through in that sense. So for some of the house painting scenes, we have a lot of more wide longer locked off shots to kind of counterbalance the movement in the verite scenes. She lives in this motorhome, which is quite cluttered and dark and messy. And then all of her work is outside in the bright sunlight. So we tried, as much as possible to show the contrast between, the light and the dark and also, how that kind of reflects in her personal life too, where she has found this path and this trade as a house painter and is well respected in that field, but still does deal with some dark personal struggles. And so we would try to, in those scenes where she's talking about that, have her mostly in her trailer. And we did do one, long interview with her where, and that's the main voiceover throughout the story, is just her telling her personal story. And for that interview too, we wanted her to be as comfortable as possible. So she's sitting, we had, a nice locked off shot, but she's sitting, in the kind of doorway of her motorhome, drinking her Smirnoff Ice, chain smoking, because that was what she did in her personal time when she wasn't working. When she was working, she was all business, wasn't drinking or smoking, but her personal life, that was, how she chose to be. So we wanted to kind of capture her natural environment as much as possible.
My film is it's mostly about Buddhist rituals that exist in Japan that allow people who've had abortions to properly grieve them. And it's told through my own story, having an abortion in the US, having one in New York, and coming across those rituals and how they affected me. In terms of form, it's really, we used a lot of different types of mediums. And the reason for that is having an abortion is such an incredibly personal experience, but the way we talk about it in the US is super political, and to make it into this like streamlined political argument, people have really simplified it. So it's become just sort of these dual answers, like, is it a life that's wrong to end, or is it just a cluster of cells that you're removing from your body? So instead, we really wanted to ask with this film, like, what does it mean to me to end a separate life that's also part of my own body? And what are all the things that go through your mind when you're trying to interpret something like that? So because there's so many different ways to look at what that is, and so many ways that really forces you to look at yourself and look inwards and look at your own life, we wanted to show that visually. So we have Super 8 film that we have of different memories, and we have watercolor paintings that represent my my memories in Japan. And we have all of those sort of different ways to like look at the situation. So that's how we decided to use different forms.
Thanks so much. Another question I have for all of you is almost pretty much with all of your approaches as well too, you're dealing with either communities or individuals from communities that might be outside of your own. And I'm curious, whether it's working with an artist or whether it's, working with undocumented workers in Paris, how is your approach and sort of like in making this film, like how much of it was like somewhat of a collaboration with those communities, and how much of it was essentially, I guess, I also sort of like, what do they think of the film?
With my contributors, I wouldn't call it a collaboration, because and I'll probably talk about when I screened the film to them, because it was just literally a couple of months ago when I went to Paris for literally 24 hours on Eurostar. I came in and out. I met them all in a restaurant together with the interpreter. I showed them the film one by one on my laptop, and I've got 3 characters in my film. One was quite emotional. He hugged me and cried. The 2 others were, it's really hard to explain, because these people are really, the life that we have in the West, or, in Asia, in Japan, it's often a bit of a reminder of how lucky and fortunate we are. Because for me, making this film and meeting these vulnerable people who, they really struggle to survive, and every 10 euros is a lot of money for them. It wasn't a collaboration per se. It was more that they really waited for me to come. They waited for me to meet them. I also helped them with money a bit because they needed so much. So it was obviously a dialogue between me and them, and now they're really good friends of mine. I mean, we text, we're on WhatsApp all the time, and we're obviously in contact. But it's a different kind of relationship. Also, obviously, there's the language barrier. So we communicate either using Google Translate on the phone, or when I did the interviews and when I met them in Paris a couple of months ago to show them the film with an interpreter. And we're really close-knit now. We're really close. But it's a different kind of relationship. It's the language barrier, but also, you know, the life that they live. It's kind of, you know, it's really heartening because, you know, I did perhaps 5 weeks at a time, going in the Eurostar to Paris, shooting, coming back. And each time, you know, going in the Eurostar, and it's only a couple of hours from Paris to London where I live, you know, you sit on the Eurostar and, you know, I've got, you know, it's so intense because I've gone through something mentally quite, you know, challenging, being with them, you know, hearing their stories, spending time with them. And then they said, Tal, you know, take every single time, take me with you. Can you not, it's always these jokes, or can you hide me under the, you know, the seat, or can you, and I say, well, I can't. And then you go back, and so it's a collaboration on a very sort of, you know, psychologically and personally, it's very taxing, but it's also very close. So I don't know if that answers the question, your question.
Yeah, no, that does. Yeah. No, thanks for that. Martyna, how about yourself?
So my film is not a traditionally character-driven piece because I'm using public testimonials, and then I was filming people in the subway. And I think maybe when we think about public transportation accessibility, maybe the first people who are being excluded who come to mind are people with disabilities. And what I realized while working on the film is that people with disabilities have been at the forefront of demanding accessibility, but that actually it's an issue that affects many people, and like parents again, or the elderly, or like people with a knee injury. So I actually felt very much that this was just a New York issue, and that I felt capable of, or I felt okay of like taking it on as a New Yorker. And then what I did really try to do when crafting the audio collage is to center the voices of those people who are like the most affected in the film. And so I'm looking forward to sharing it with different organizations that are being represented at the meetings, at the MTA board meetings, and see how they can use it to advance their demands.
I think Jamie and Maureen at first were like, you want to, the people who we feature in the film, they were like, oh, you want to film us just fishing for a day? And I was like, yes. And they were sort of like, okay, sure, we're on board. But then I think the more that we talked about it, there's really big political issues about Indigenous rights when it comes to land management and resource management. So for example, they're pursued a lot by the Fisheries Commission for this traditional harvesting that they're legally allowed to do. And they get a lot of pressure from these fish, we call them fish cops, to stop what they're doing, even though they're legally allowed to do these things and harvest from the land. So when they found out we were doing a film about it, they were like, oh yeah. And it became more and more like sort of heated and political, because oftentimes the fish cops come and interrupt them while they're fishing and sort of give them a hard time, demand to see papers, because you have to carry a license with you. And, you know, really try to push back when they're fishing. And so in the middle of the shoot, they were hoping that the fish cops would come and chat with us, because it would really highlight the issue that they keep facing, that they keep sort of, by practicing, they're pushing against them. And it's been a really contentious issue in Canada lately about Indigenous rights and Indigenous people hunting and fishing and using the land. And it's really come to a head a lot with some people being killed, whether that's on purpose or, you know, an accidental shooting. And it's become a really big issue that has sort of highlighted the racism and the inequalities in the Indigenous rights and in the Indigenous communities across Canada. So I think once, you know, we started filming, they got really excited that we were going to be able to show this and show this film to other people, to show them what they're doing. Because I think often there's a misconception that Indigenous people are taking too much from the land. And, you know, how much fish can two women pull out of a lake is another question. So I think they were really, they were happy with the outcomes, but I think also it's the larger message that they're trying to spread about what they're actually doing out on the land, instead of sort of the perceived ideas when it gets written about in the newspaper and it has no connection to anything. So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience, because we had, you know, 8 women on the ice all hanging out together for 2 days. And looking back on it now where we are in like COVID pandemic times, it feels like such a far away thing that might not ever happen again. And so I feel like the film also has sort of a different point of view now than it did when we filmed it last year.
Alison, how about yourself, specifically in terms of working with the artist?
You know, you always have to get to know people and kind of convince them to trust you. And I think Azuma has a great open spirit. From, you know, I met him years before I actually got the money and teamed together to make this film. And we had kind of been in touch over the years, and he was always super generous about it. And the film really couldn't have had the scope that it had without him offering some of his footage of projects that happened before I was there, and you know, also the high-res files of his works. And like, I think, you know, that's both because he was incredibly, you know, generous and collaborative in spirit, and also because that's how I go into things. I think I just like to be really thorough, and I both want that trust, and I also hope to get access to as much of, you know, an artist's work and personal archives, you know, which you kind of only get if they trust you, so that you can have so much at your fingertips to tell the story. I would say my approach in sort of doing it like an elevated but still like verite, and trying to do, you know, fly on the wall kind of filming with a very small crew, I think that was like new to him, which was what I wanted. He has collaborated also a lot with you know, fashion brands. Like, he sometimes makes money doing commercial jobs, you know, and so I think he's very used to, and even when NHK does a doc about him, you know, it's like a different style. And I feel like I feel like there were a lot of times in the beginning we had to get used to each other's rhythm, or he maybe had to get used to mine, because I didn't really want to tell him what to, I just was like, I want to see what it's going to be if I, you know, if this was just a regular day, or, you know, if we're going to this. And I think, you know, kind of creating that space for to be observational was maybe like a bit of a challenge. But he took us home to, you know, meet his mom and his brother, and, you know, we like flew to his hometown. And I think putting in, you know, going for those kinds of things, I could sometimes sense that he was like, is this what you want? Or like, what is it that you want? So I was just always thinking about how much I wanted to kind of clue him in or give direction, but also how much I kind of wanted to keep him like, you know, I want to ease the questioning and the concerns, but like give him the space to, you know, just be not looking to me for direction, so that I could just observe, because that's what I like to do.
Yeah, you know, when we first approached Millie about this film, and we were introduced through one of her clients, actually, who was currently having her paint their house. And she was really excited about it, and, you know, kind of claimed that she always wanted to be rich and famous, even though we assured her that documentaries don't really make people rich and famous unless you're very lucky. But she was very open and has watched a ton of movies in the past. So it was like, she got it right away, and, you know, really enjoyed the whole process. Neither Jessica or I are part of the LGBTQ community. And Millie, you know, while she identifies as transgender, she doesn't actually herself really identify with the community or relate to that community, and is, you know, not at all stereotypical of what you would think of someone who identifies as trans. So, you know, I think on the one hand, we wanted to be really authentic to Millie and represent her story as, you know, from her perspective, but at the same time, we were aware of how the LGBTQ and trans community specifically might perceive her story. And, you know, some of the things she says, she calls herself a redneck and is sort of a libertarian and doesn't have very kind of PC views on some things. And, you know, we didn't want to shy away from including that because that's who she is, but we also didn't want to offend other people who she is also sort of representing by calling herself trans. So, you know, it was a kind of a fine line to walk and to try to balance in the edit. But I think ultimately we wanted to be true to Millie's story and her character. And, you know, she's seen the film, we showed her. We were supposed to have our premiere at South by, which would have been, you know, we were sort of hoping to give her that hometown premiere and give her red carpet moment. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but we had showed her the film like right before stuff kind of shut down, and she loved it. And, you know, just told me recently in a text she's watched it 20 times. And, you know, has noticed all these little subtleties. So she's really happy with how she's portrayed, you know, especially she's someone who sort of lived her life, you know, a little bit as an outsider and in the shadows a bit, but really has a lot to say and wants that moment in the spotlight. So I think, you know, she's appreciated that platform to just sort of show the world who she is. Hopefully we'll have the chance to screen the film at some LGBTQ festivals. We haven't yet. You know, just from friends who've seen it in that community, you know, have had positive responses, but I am really interested and curious to screen the film for those audiences and see what the feedback is. But yeah, it's definitely something, you know, we were very sensitive to how we portrayed that story, given that, you know, we are outsiders to that community in a sense.
And Kira, I know with your story in particular, because it is something that's very personal, I'm curious how maybe some of it might have been in terms of, I guess you could say, getting the cultural standpoint of like what you're getting across, I guess you could say correctly in terms of, you know, but also framing it in a way for like American or more Western audiences to understand.
What was interesting about Buddhist MIZUKO Kuyo rituals is that even in Japan, not a lot of people know about it. And it's something that's kind of just there if you go to seek it out, or there if you know about it. And it's just to give you guys some context, it's sort of these statues, these Buddhist Jizo statues that is this character that's supposed to represent both a Buddhist figure that goes to return your lost child back to the sea, but it also at the same time looks like a child, and it kind of represents your lost child. So these statues exist in Japan in a lot of temples, but people kind of just pass by it and don't really know its purpose unless you kind of are knowledgeable about that. A lot of how we connected to it was through research and through written books about it. And we had this really, really good resource by an author named William LaFleur all about the ritual and about its history. So yeah, like you said, a lot of the film was kind of looking at that and looking inwards. But when we finally went to Japan towards the end of our process to go shoot at the actual temples, it was this pretty magical moment, because all of that looking inwards and all of that kind of research was sort of like there it was physically in front of us, and that was a totally different thing. But yeah, so I think the film really kind of just reflects that sort of discovery, that kind of personal discovery. It was a difficult thing to balance, like trying to balance all of my own personal experiences with abortion with kind of this like really long cultural history, and trying to do that in a short film. But the most kind of like, you know, the way we did it, we didn't interview anyone else in Japan who's had abortions. We didn't do any kind of like connection with community. But the most sort of similar kind of experience to that I had was I had to go make, part of the film was me doing the ritual and doing it myself. So I went to Japan, and in Tokyo, there's this Buddhist monk kind of hidden away in this really random neighborhood who helps people do the ritual and also make their own statues. He like teaches people how to make the statues out of clay. So I sat just one morning in Tokyo during our shoot week and went to this Buddhist monk, and we sat down in this little room, and he like helped me mold my clay figure that represented, my aborted child, which was, so different from like anything in the US. But yeah, with this film, that's kind of all context that doesn't really we don't really talk about that in the film or show that. But we were really hoping with the film that once people realize that there are these kind of rituals and there are these ways of thinking about it, that maybe we could find ways to bring some of that practice to the US, or maybe we can have screenings where we sort of maybe open that up to people to try out themselves, people who've had abortions themselves, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That too, thank you everyone for not just sharing your films with us, but also just your time today and talking a bit about how you made them as well. And with that, for everybody watching, please tell your friends. This shorts program is available to screen until June 21st. And we'd also love to hear from you on social media at #AFIDocs. And join us for more great films and virtual events at docs.afi.com. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.